The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of Buckingham Palace, as Officer James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he thought would be another routine day. 28 years old, with 5 years of service in the Queen's Guard, James had grown accustomed to the strict protocols that governed every moment of his duty. The red tunic felt heavier than usual as he took his position at the main entrance, his bearskin hat perfectly aligned, his rifle held at the precise angle demanded by centuries of tradition. The palace grounds buzzed with the usual activity of a Tuesday morning in June. Tourists gathered behind the iron gates, cameras ready to capture the stoic guards who had become as much a symbol of Britain as the crown jewels themselves. James had learned to tune out the constant chatter, the flash of cameras, and the occasional attempt by visitors to make him smile or break his composure. His training had been thorough and unforgiving. Never move unless commanded. Never speak unless spoken to by a superior. Never break formation under any circumstances. What James didn't know was that 3 blocks away, a man named Marcus Webb was having the worst day of his life. Webb, a 42-year-old construction worker from Manchester, had just received a phone call that would change everything. His ex-wife had been granted full custody of their 8-year-old daughter, Emma. The court had decided that his drinking problem and recent job loss made him an unfit father. The legal papers in his trembling hands felt like a death sentence. Emma was the only good thing left in his world, and now she was being taken away. Webb had driven to London in a rage, his mind clouded by alcohol and desperation. He had some twisted idea that if he could somehow reach the Queen, if he could make his case to the highest authority in the land, maybe something could be done, maybe justice could still prevail. It was the desperate thinking of a broken man who had nowhere else to turn. The bottle of whiskey on his passenger seat was already half empty, and his hands shook as he parked his battered Ford near St. James's Park. As Webb stumbled through the crowds of tourists, his eyes fixed on the palace gates, James continued his measured patrol. The guards' trained eyes constantly scanned the area, noting every face, every movement, every potential threat. It was a skill that had been drilled into him during months of intensive training. He could spot trouble before it fully developed, read body language like a book, and assess threats in seconds. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what was about to unfold. The first sign of trouble came at 11:30, when Webb pushed through a group of German tourists, shouting something about his daughter and demanding to see the Queen. Security personnel near the gates immediately noticed the disturbance, but Webb was still technically on public property. James watched from his post as the man gestured wildly, his words slurred but his anger crystal clear. The normal protocol would be to let the police handle any civilian disturbances outside the palace grounds. Webb's frustration grew as security guards approached him calmly, trying to defuse the situation. They spoke in measured tones, explaining that the Queen wasn't available, that there were proper channels for citizen complaints, that he needed to calm down and step back. But Webb was beyond reason. In his alcohol-fueled state, every word of explanation sounded like another door slamming in his face. Another person telling him he didn't matter, that his pain wasn't important enough. James felt his muscles tense as he watched the situation escalate. His orders were clear and absolute. Maintain position. Do not interfere with civilian matters unless directly threatened or commanded by a superior officer. The palace guards were trained to be living statues, symbols of unwavering discipline and obedience. Personal judgment was not part of their job description. Yet something in Webb's desperate movements, in the way he clutched those legal papers, triggered an uncomfortable feeling in James's chest. The crowd began to thin as tourists sensed the tension and moved away from the gates. This left Webb more exposed, more desperate, and increasingly agitated. He began pacing back and forth, his voice growing louder as he demanded justice, demanded to be heard, demanded that someone in power acknowledge his pain. The security guards maintained their professional distance, calling for backup and trying to contain the situation without physical intervention. What happened next would be debated in newspapers, investigated by internal affairs, and discussed in military academies for years to come. As Webb reached into his jacket pocket, several things occurred simultaneously. The security guards tensed, their hands moving instinctively toward their radios in defensive positions. Tourists screamed and scattered, and James Mitchell, despite 5 years of flawless service and unwavering obedience to protocol, felt his training war with his instincts as he watched a desperate father's final moments of hope crumble before his eyes. Webb's hand emerged from his jacket holding a crumpled photograph of his daughter Emma, her gap-toothed smile beaming from a school picture taken just 6 months earlier. But from the distance of the security guards and the angle they were positioned, it looked like he might be reaching for a weapon. The misunderstanding happened in slow motion, yet everything accelerated beyond control in a matter of heartbeats. James watched as 3 security guards rushed toward Webb, their movements sharp and aggressive. Webb, confused and frightened by their sudden advance, stumbled backward and raised his hands defensively. The photograph fluttered to the ground, forgotten in the chaos. One guard tackled Webb to the pavement, while another called for immediate police backup. The sound of Webb's head hitting the concrete echoed across the courtyard with a sickening crack. The strict commands that governed James's every move seemed to echo in his mind like a broken record. Stay at your post. Do not interfere. Maintain discipline. But as he watched Webb writhing on the ground, blood beginning to pool beneath his head, something deeper than training took over. This wasn't a terrorist or a criminal. This was a desperate father who had simply wanted someone to listen to his pain. Webb tried to push himself up from the pavement, his movements unsteady from both alcohol and the head injury. Blood ran down his face from a gash above his left eye, and his words became even more slurred as he pleaded with the guards to let him explain about Emma. The security team was following their own protocols perfectly, containing what they perceived as a threat until police could arrive to handle the situation properly. James felt his grip tighten on his rifle as he watched the scene unfold. In his 5 years of service, he had never once broken protocol. His record was spotless, his obedience absolute. His commanding officers had praised him as the model of what a Queen's Guard should be, unwavering in discipline and dedication to duty. Yet as Webb's blood spread across the pale stone of the courtyard, James felt something crack inside his chest. The other guards at their posts remained perfectly still, their faces hidden beneath their bearskin hats, their expressions unreadable behind the facade of ceremonial duty. They had all seen the incident, but none moved. This was exactly how they had been trained to respond, how centuries of tradition demanded they respond. Personal feelings had no place in their service to the crown. Webb made another attempt to stand, his legs shaking as he reached desperately for the fallen photograph of Emma. The security guards pushed him back down, their voices firm as they ordered him to remain on the ground until police arrived. Webb's cries for his daughter grew more desperate, more heartbreaking, as the reality of his situation began to penetrate through the alcohol and head trauma. James could see Emma's face clearly now from his elevated position. The little girl in the photograph looked exactly like his own niece, Sarah, who was the same age and had the same bright smile. He remembered how devastated his brother had been during his own custody battle 2 years earlier. The legal system could be cold and unforgiving, especially to fathers who were struggling with personal demons but still loved their children deeply. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as London Metropolitan Police units responded to the security call. James knew that within minutes Webb would be arrested, charged with disorderly conduct and possibly assaulting an officer. The man would likely spend the night in jail, miss his final supervised visit with Emma, and have this incident used against him in future custody proceedings. The system would grind forward with mechanical precision, and one more broken father would disappear into its machinery. Webb's struggles were growing weaker as blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. He was no longer trying to stand, just reaching pathetically toward the photograph that lay just inches from his fingertips. His words had become unintelligible whispers about Emma and justice and how nobody would listen. The security guards maintained their positions around him, professional and alert, waiting for the police to arrive and take custody. James felt sweat beating beneath his ceremonial hat despite the cool morning air. Every fiber of his training screamed at him to remain motionless, to trust in the system, to let the proper authorities handle the situation. But another voice, one that sounded suspiciously like his own father's, whispered about honor and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The first police car rounded the corner, its blue lights flashing across the faces of the remaining tourists who huddled behind barriers set up by additional security personnel. In less than 60 seconds, Webb would be in handcuffs and on his way to a holding cell. The incident would be filed away as another routine disturbance outside the palace, a minor disruption in an otherwise ordinary day. As the police car pulled up to the gates, James made a decision that would change his life forever. He stepped forward, abandoning his post for the first time in 5 years of faithful service. His movement was slight, barely noticeable to most observers, but it was a violation of everything he had sworn to uphold. The other guards remained frozen in position, their training holding them fast even as they watched their colleague break the most fundamental rule of their service. James took another step forward, his polished boots clicking against the stone with a sound that seemed to echo like thunder in his own ears. The movement caught the attention of Sergeant Williams, his immediate superior, who had been monitoring the situation from the guard station. Williams's eyes went wide beneath his own ceremonial hat as he watched his most reliable guard abandon protocol in broad daylight with dozens of witnesses and cameras recording every moment. The police officers emerged from their vehicle with practiced efficiency, their attention focused entirely on Webb and the security guards surrounding him. They didn't notice the subtle movement of the palace guard, didn't see James struggling with a decision that went against everything he had been taught to believe about duty and obedience. To them, the Queen's guards were just part of the scenery, as permanent and unchanging as the palace walls themselves. Webb's breathing had become labored, each breath creating small bubbles in the blood that had pooled near his mouth. The head injury was clearly more serious than anyone had initially realized, but the security guards were focused on restraint rather than medical care. Their training taught them to neutralize threats first and worry about consequences later. The approaching police would make the medical decisions once they had the situation fully under control. James could see Emma's photograph more clearly now, the image of the little girl's face torn and dirty from its contact with the pavement. There was something about the way Webb kept reaching for that picture, even through his pain and confusion, that reminded James of his own father. He remembered the stories his dad used to tell about his service in Northern Ireland, about times when following orders felt wrong but breaking them felt impossible. Sergeant Williams began moving toward James, his own movement careful and controlled to avoid drawing attention from the media cameras that had appeared seemingly from nowhere. A guard abandoning his post during a security incident would be front-page news across Britain and around the world. The reputation of the Queen's Guard, built over centuries of unwavering discipline, could be damaged by a single moment of poor judgment. The lead police officer knelt beside Webb, his voice calm and professional as he began the standard arrest procedure. Webb tried to focus on the officer's words, but his head injury made everything seem distant and unclear. He mumbled Emma's name repeatedly, trying to explain about the custody hearing, about how he wasn't dangerous, about how he just needed someone in authority to understand his situation. James felt his legs trembling beneath him as he took a third step forward. He was now clearly out of position, his abandonment of protocol obvious to anyone who understood how the guard system worked. The tourists didn't notice, but his fellow guards did. He could feel their eyes on him, could sense their confusion and concern. They had trained together, served together, and now he was putting all of them in an impossible position. The security guards began to step back as the police took control of the situation, their job essentially complete once law enforcement arrived on scene. Webb was no longer their responsibility, and they could return to their normal duties of monitoring the palace perimeter for legitimate threats. The incident would be filed in their reports as a routine disturbance handled according to established procedures. Webb's struggles had grown weaker, but his grip on consciousness remained strong enough for him to keep whispering about Emma. The police officer checking his injuries frowned as he noticed the severity of the head wound. Blood loss and possible concussion were serious medical concerns that needed immediate attention. But first they had to secure the scene and ensure Webb wasn't carrying any actual weapons. James could hear Sergeant Williams approaching from behind. The older man's footsteps measured and deliberate. Williams had served for 15 years without a single mark on his record, and he wasn't about to let one of his guards destroy both their careers in a moment of misguided heroism. He would try to get James back to his position before anyone in authority noticed the breach of protocol. The gathered crowd of tourists had grown larger as word spread about the incident outside the palace. Smartphones appeared everywhere, recording every moment of the drama for social media posts and news outlets. James realized that whatever he did next would be captured forever, analyzed by experts, and used as evidence in whatever disciplinary proceedings might follow. Webb's hand finally reached Emma's photograph, his fingers closing around the torn paper with desperate tenderness. For a moment, his face relaxed into something resembling peace as he held his daughter's image close to his chest. It was a simple human gesture that cut through all the protocol and procedure, all the rules and regulations that governed how such situations should be handled. The police officer completed his initial assessment and signaled for an ambulance, recognizing that Webb needed medical attention before he could be properly processed and charged. The man was clearly in no condition for a standard arrest procedure, and any statement he gave would likely be inadmissible due to his head injury and intoxication. The situation had moved beyond simple disorderly conduct into something more complex and tragic. James made his decision in that moment, watching a broken father clutch a picture of his lost daughter while blood ran down his face onto the cold stone of the palace courtyard. He stepped completely out of formation, breaking 5 years of perfect service and centuries of tradition, moving toward a man who had no one else willing to break the rules to help him. James walked deliberately toward the scene, his ceremonial rifle still held at the proper angle despite his complete abandonment of protocol. Each step felt like crossing an invisible line that separated his old life from whatever consequences awaited him. The red tunic that had always made him feel proud now felt like a target, marking him as someone who should know better than to interfere in civilian affairs. Sergeant Williams quickened his pace, knowing he had only seconds to prevent a career-ending mistake. His voice was low but urgent as he called out, "Mitchell, return to your post immediately." The command carried the weight of military authority and 5 years of mutual respect, but James continued moving forward as if he hadn't heard. Williams realized with growing horror that his most reliable guard was about to destroy everything they had both worked for. The police officer looked up in surprise as James approached, recognizing the distinctive uniform, but confused by the guard's presence away from his designated position. Palace guards simply didn't involve themselves in civilian incidents, and this officer had responded to dozens of disturbances outside the gates without ever seeing such a breach of protocol. He wondered if there was some security threat he hadn't been briefed about. Webb's eyes struggled to focus as James knelt beside him, the golden buttons and red fabric of the guard's uniform swimming in and out of clarity. Through his pain and confusion, Webb felt a moment of hope. Maybe someone in authority was finally going to listen to his story about Emma. Maybe there was still a chance that justice could prevail, that his daughter wouldn't be lost to him forever. The crowd of tourists began murmuring and pointing as they witnessed something unprecedented. Phones and cameras captured every moment as one of the Queen's legendary guards broke character in the most public way possible. Tour guides struggled to explain what was happening, their usual scripts about ceremonial duty and unwavering discipline suddenly meaningless in the face of this human drama. James spoke quietly to Webb, his voice gentle despite his own training to remain silent except when addressed by superiors. "Sir, you're injured and need medical attention. The ambulance is coming, and everything is going to be all right." The words felt strange coming from lips that had been trained to speak only when absolutely necessary, but they seemed to calm Webb's desperate struggles. Sergeant Williams reached the scene just as James placed a supportive hand on Webb's shoulder, a gesture that violated every principle of guard conduct, but somehow felt like the most natural thing in the world. Williams faced an impossible choice: forcibly remove his guard and create an even bigger spectacle, or allow the breach to continue and face the consequences later. Either decision would likely end both their careers. The police officer tried to process this unexpected development while maintaining control of his crime scene. A Queen's Guard providing comfort to a suspect was so far outside normal procedure that he had no protocols to follow. He looked to Williams for guidance, recognizing the sergeant's rank and authority, but found the older man frozen in his own moment of crisis. Webb's grip on Emma's photograph loosened slightly as James's presence seemed to bring him some measure of peace. The blood flow from his head wound was slowing, but the injury clearly needed immediate medical attention. His whispered words about his daughter became clearer as James's calm voice encouraged him to stay conscious and keep talking about what had brought him to this desperate moment. The ambulance sirens grew louder as emergency medical services responded to the police call for assistance. James knew that within minutes Webb would be taken to hospital and then processed through the legal system that had already failed him once. This moment of human connection might be the only kindness the broken father would experience in what was certain to be a long and difficult road ahead. Williams finally found his voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. "Officer Mitchell, you are in direct violation of standing orders. Return to your post immediately before this situation becomes irreparable." But even as he spoke the words, Williams could see that James had made a decision that went beyond military discipline. The young guard was operating from a moral compass that superseded all their training. The lead police officer decided to treat James as part of the authorized response team rather than challenge his presence and create additional complications. Sometimes in crisis situations, it was better to work with unexpected developments rather than fight them. If the guard's presence was helping to keep the injured man calm, there would be time to sort out procedural questions later. Webb managed to focus his eyes on James's face, seeing something in the young man's expression that reminded him of his own father, who had served in the Royal Navy decades earlier. There was a quality of service and honor that transcended uniform and rank, a recognition of one man's duty to help another regardless of regulations or consequences. For the first time since receiving the custody papers, Webb felt like someone understood his pain. James helped Webb hold Emma's photograph steady so he could see his daughter's face clearly. The simple act of human kindness seemed to strengthen Webb's resolve and clear his thinking despite the head injury. He began speaking more coherently about the custody hearing, about his struggles with alcohol and unemployment, about his desperate love for the little girl who had become his only reason for living. The arriving ambulance crew quickly assessed the situation and began preparing Webb for transport to the nearest hospital. James stepped back to give them room to work, but remained close enough that Webb could see him. The guard's presence had clearly had a calming effect on the injured man, and the paramedics were grateful for anything that made their job easier in such a chaotic environment. The paramedics worked quickly to stabilize Webb for transport, checking his pupils for signs of concussion and cleaning the head wound that had bled so dramatically across the palace courtyard. James remained nearby, his presence continuing to keep Webb calm even as medical professionals took over his care. The guard watched as they carefully preserved Emma's photograph, understanding instinctively how important that small piece of paper was to the injured father. News cameras had begun arriving as word spread about the unprecedented incident outside Buckingham Palace. A Queen's Guard abandoning his post was international news, and reporters scrambled to understand what had driven such a disciplined soldier to break centuries of tradition. James could see the camera crews setting up equipment, knowing that his face would soon be broadcast around the world as either a hero or a disgrace. Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of the Queen's Guard, arrived on scene with the grim expression of a man whose worst nightmare was unfolding in real time. Harrison had served for 22 years without a single major incident under his command, and now one of his guards had created a public relations disaster that would require explanations to the highest levels of government and military hierarchy. Webb was loaded onto a stretcher, but as the paramedics prepared to move him to the ambulance, he grabbed James's wrist with surprising strength. Through his pain and medication, Webb managed to whisper a thank you that carried the weight of a desperate father's gratitude. James nodded silently, understanding that this moment of human connection had made all the career consequences worthwhile. The police officer in charge approached Colonel Harrison to discuss the unusual circumstances of the incident. A civilian disturbance was routine, but a Queen's Guard becoming emotionally involved complicated everything. There would be questions about security protocols, about whether James's actions indicated some kind of threat assessment that others had missed, about why a trained soldier had felt compelled to break his orders. Sergeant Williams stood at attention as Colonel Harrison approached, preparing for the most difficult conversation of his military career. As James's immediate superior, Williams would share responsibility for the breach of protocol. His own spotless record would be forever marked by his inability to control one of his guards during a critical moment. The weight of tradition and military hierarchy pressed down on both men. James remained perfectly still as Webb was wheeled toward the ambulance, his ceremonial rifle once again held at the proper angle, despite everything that had happened. The crowd of tourists continued to stare and photograph, sensing they had witnessed something extraordinary but not fully understanding the magnitude of what had just occurred. To them, it had been a simple act of human kindness, But to the military establishment, it represented a fundamental breakdown of order and discipline. The ambulance doors closed with Webb safely inside, but through the rear window the injured father continued to clutch Emma's photograph to his chest. James felt a strange sense of completion, knowing that he had given a desperate man a moment of dignity and human connection in what was certainly one of the darkest periods of his life. The guard had no way of knowing that this simple act would change both their lives forever. Colonel Harrison's voice was crisp and controlled as he addressed James directly. "Officer Mitchell, you are relieved of duty pending a full investigation into your conduct. You will report to my office immediately for debriefing and disciplinary proceedings." The words were delivered without emotion, but everyone present understood that James's career as a Queen's Guard was effectively over. The media frenzy began in earnest, as reporters recognized the significance of the scene they had just witnessed. Headlines were already being written about the Guard who chose compassion over duty, about the breakdown of military discipline at Britain's most symbolic location. James would soon find himself at the center of a national debate about honor, duty, and the human cost of rigid adherence to protocol. As James began his walk back toward the palace under Colonel Harrison's stern supervision, he caught sight of his fellow guards still standing at their posts. Their faces were hidden beneath their ceremonial hats, but he could sense their mixture of admiration and concern. They understood better than anyone what he had sacrificed for a stranger's moment of need. Webb watched through the ambulance window as his unlikely guardian angel disappeared into the crowd of officials and media personnel. The pain medication was beginning to take effect, but he remained lucid enough to understand that someone had risked everything to show him kindness when the rest of the world seemed determined to grind him down. It was a debt he knew he could never repay, but one he would never forget. The ambulance pulled away from the palace gates, carrying Webb toward a hospital where his injuries would be treated, and his legal situation would be sorted out by social workers and public defenders. But thanks to James's intervention, he would face those challenges with a restored sense of his own human dignity and the knowledge that at least one person had seen past his desperation to the loving father underneath. The crowd of tourists began to disperse as police cleared. The area and palace security returned to normal operations. The blood on the courtyard stones was washed away within an hour, leaving no physical evidence of the incident. But the photographs and videos captured by dozens of witnesses would ensure that this moment lived on in digital immortality, sparking debates about duty and humanity that would continue long after both men had moved on with their dramatically changed lives. 3 hours later, James sat in Colonel Harrison's office facing a disciplinary board that would determine his military future. The room felt smaller than usual, filled with senior officers whose combined service spanned decades of unwavering adherence to protocol and tradition. James's actions had created ripples that extended far beyond a single moment of compassion, challenging the very foundation of military discipline that kept the Queen's Guard functioning as the world's most respected ceremonial unit. The questioning was thorough and relentless. Each board member probed James's motivations, his understanding of regulations, and his awareness of the consequences his actions would have for the reputation of the entire Guard unit. James answered honestly, explaining his belief that Webb posed no real threat and his instinct that the injured man needed immediate human support beyond medical care. His words sounded weak even to his own ears when measured against 2 centuries of military tradition. Meanwhile, at St. Mary's Hospital, Webb was undergoing treatment for his concussion and the deep laceration above his eye. The medical staff worked efficiently to clean and suture his wounds, but they couldn't repair the emotional trauma that had driven him to the palace gates. Social workers had been called to assess his mental state and determine whether he posed a danger to himself or others. The news story was spreading rapidly across social media and traditional news outlets. Videos of James leaving his post to comfort Webb played on loop, accompanied by expert commentary about military discipline and the human cost of rigid adherence to duty. Public opinion was sharply divided between those who saw James as a hero and those who viewed his actions as a dangerous breakdown of military order. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen had been assigned to investigate the incident from the civilian perspective. She reviewed security footage, interviewed witnesses, and tried to piece together the sequence of events that had led to such an unprecedented breach of palace protocol. Chen found herself impressed by James's calm assessment of the situation. and his recognition that Webb needed help rather than additional restraint. James's parents drove down from Yorkshire after seeing their son's face on the evening news. His father, a retired army sergeant, struggled with conflicting emotions about his son's actions. Part of him was proud that James had shown such compassion for a fellow human being, but another part worried about the military career that seemed to be ending before it had truly begun. The hospital's psychiatric evaluation of Webb revealed a man in genuine crisis but not a criminal or terrorist threat. Dr. Patricia Miles, the attending psychiatrist, noted that Webb's love for his daughter was genuine and that his desperate actions at the palace stemmed from a father's grief rather than any desire to cause harm. Her report would prove crucial in determining how the legal system would ultimately handle his case. Colonel Harrison found himself in an impossible position, caught between military regulations that demanded severe punishment for James's breach of protocol and growing public support for the Guard's humanitarian actions. Phone calls from political figures and senior military officials complicated his decision-making process, with some demanding strict adherence to regulations while others suggested that flexibility might be warranted, given the unique circumstances. Webb's ex-wife, Linda, saw the news coverage from her home in Manchester and experienced a complex mix of emotions. She had painted Marcus as an unstable father during their custody battle, but watching him clutch Emma's photograph while injured and bleeding made her question whether she had been too harsh in her assessment. The incident forced her to confront the possibility that Marcus's love for their daughter was genuine, even if his methods of expressing it were severely flawed. James's fellow guards maintained their positions throughout the day, but privately they debated his actions during their brief break periods. Some admired his courage in choosing humanity over protocol, while others worried about the precedent his actions might set. If guards could abandon their posts whenever they felt emotional about civilian incidents, the entire structure of their service could collapse. The disciplinary hearing continued into the evening as the board reviewed James's service record, his training reports and testimony from his fellow guards and superior officers. Sergeant Williams spoke on James's behalf, describing him as the most reliable and dedicated guard under his command. Williams argued that James's actions demonstrated exceptional judgment rather than a failure of discipline, recognizing a situation where human compassion was more important than rigid adherence to protocol. Webb spent the night in hospital under observation for his head injury, but his thoughts remained focused on Emma and the guard who had shown him such unexpected kindness. He asked the nurses repeatedly about James's fate, worried that his own desperate actions had destroyed the career of the only person who had treated him with dignity during his darkest hour. The story had gone international by midnight, with news outlets around the world picking up the footage of a Queen's Guard abandoning his post to comfort an injured civilian. Editorial writers and commentators debated the incident's implications for military discipline, the nature of duty, and the balance between following orders and following conscience. James had become a symbol for a broader conversation about humanity's place in rigid institutional structures. Public support for James grew throughout the day as more details about Webb's situation emerged. Social media campaigns demanding leniency for the Guard gained momentum, while online fundraising efforts sought to help Webb pay for legal representation in his ongoing custody battle. The incident had touched something deep in the public consciousness about the importance of compassion over bureaucracy. Emma Webb watched the news coverage with her mother, not fully understanding the complex adult emotions involved, but recognizing her father's face on television. At 8 years old, she only knew that Daddy had been hurt and that a soldier had helped him. Her innocent questions about why the soldier was in trouble for being nice would haunt Linda Webb's dreams for weeks to come. 6 weeks after the incident, James Mitchell stood in the same office where his military career had seemingly ended, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The disciplinary board's final decision had taken weeks of deliberation, review of public sentiment, consultation with senior military leadership, and careful consideration of unprecedented circumstances that had no clear precedent in military law. Colonel Harrison delivered the verdict with the measured tone of a career officer who had learned to balance military tradition with evolving social expectations. James would receive an official reprimand for abandoning his post, but he would not be dismissed from service. Instead, he was being transferred to a new position within the palace security detail, one that would allow him to use his demonstrated ability to assess civilian situations and provide appropriate intervention when needed. The public campaign supporting James had grown beyond anyone's expectations, with letters of support arriving from around the world. Military veterans, social workers, family advocates, and ordinary citizens had written to express their belief that James's actions represented the best qualities of service and honor. The Queen herself had reportedly taken a personal interest in the case, though official palace sources would neither confirm nor deny her involvement in the final decision. Webb's legal situation had also improved dramatically, thanks in part to the public attention his case had received. Pro bono lawyers had stepped forward to help him navigate the custody system, and a rehabilitation program had been arranged to address his drinking problem. Most importantly, the judge overseeing his case had been moved by the incident to order a new evaluation of his fitness as a father, recognizing that his desperate actions had been motivated by love rather than malice. The meeting between James and Webb had been arranged quietly, away from media attention, at the hospital where Webb was completing his recovery. Both men struggled to find words for the strange bond that had been forged in those brief moments outside the palace gates. Webb's head wound had healed cleanly, leaving only a small scar above his left eye, but the emotional healing would take much longer. Emma Webb had been allowed to visit her father in the hospital, their first meeting since the custody decision that had driven him to such desperate measures. The 8-year-old girl brought him a drawing she had made of a soldier helping someone who was hurt, her childish artwork capturing the essence of compassion that had started this entire chain of events. Webb kept the drawing folded carefully next to the now restored photograph that James had helped him protect. Linda Webb had requested a private meeting with James, wanting to thank him for showing her ex-husband kindness during his lowest moment. The conversation was difficult and emotional, as Linda struggled to reconcile the image of Marcus as an unstable father with the video footage of a broken man clutching their daughter's photograph while bleeding on palace stones. She had begun to question whether her approach to the custody battle had been too harsh, whether Marcus deserved a chance to prove he could be the father Emma needed. The media attention gradually faded as other stories captured public interest. But the changes set in motion by those few minutes outside Buckingham Palace continued to ripple outward. James's new role within palace security included training other guards on civilian crisis intervention, helping them recognize when rigid protocol needed to give way to human judgment. His experience had become a case study in military academies around the world, sparking debates about the evolution of duty in modern society. Webb successfully completed his rehabilitation program and was granted supervised visitation rights with Emma. The little girl was initially shy during their first meeting in months, but she warmed quickly when her father showed her the drawing she had made of the soldier. Webb spoke carefully about the importance of getting help when life becomes overwhelming. Lessons he was still learning himself but wanted desperately to share with his daughter. Sergeant Williams had been promoted to a new position overseeing guard training, partly in recognition of his support for James during the disciplinary proceedings. Williams used his experience to develop new protocols that balanced traditional military discipline with the reality that guards might face situations requiring immediate human intervention. The balance between duty and compassion became a central theme in his training programs. The photograph of Emma that had started everything was now framed and sitting on Webb's bedside table in the small apartment he had rented near his daughter's school. Beside it sat the child's drawing of the soldier, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or protocols, but with simple human kindness. Webb had begun attending group therapy sessions for divorced fathers, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about how desperation can lead to destructive choices. James found unexpected satisfaction in his new role, working with social services and police to develop better responses to civilian mental health crises near government buildings. His experience with Webb had opened his eyes to the complex human stories behind what security personnel often dismissed as routine disturbances. Each case was different, but they all involved people who felt unheard and desperate for someone in authority to acknowledge their pain. The incident had changed both men in ways neither could have anticipated. James learned that true honor sometimes required breaking rules rather than following them blindly. Webb discovered that admitting weakness and asking for help could be signs of strength rather than failure. Both carried forward the memory of those brief moments when two strangers connected across the vast divide between duty and desperation. Emma Webb was now spending alternating weekends with her father, their relationship slowly rebuilding on a foundation of honest communication and mutual respect. She was too young to fully understand the dramatic events that had brought them back together, but she sensed that something important had changed. Her father seemed calmer, more focused, more present when they were together. The soldier from her drawing had somehow helped make her daddy better. Years later, when Emma was old enough to understand the full story, she would learn that sometimes the most heroic acts happen when ordinary people choose compassion over convenience, when they risk everything to show kindness to a stranger in need. The incident outside Buckingham Palace had become part of her family's history, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, human connection could light the way forward. James Mitchell continued his service with the Queen's Guard, but with a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to protect and serve. His actions had challenged centuries of tradition and sparked important conversations about the evolution of duty in a complex world. Most importantly, he had learned that the greatest honor came not from following orders perfectly, but from recognizing when humanity demanded a different kind of courage altogether.